So thank you very much for being here, Jacob and Rudy. And it's been a privilege for the Serpentine teams to have worked with you on different projects and collaborations over the years. And I really wanted us to have a conversation about those projects and about your practices, because somehow they feel very entangled with what Queer Earth and Wicked Matters is trying to explore. And I think perhaps we will start with the first project that I mentioned. We have some images that you want to show everyone, which says Sweet Rebellion, a resource that you developed for history and art teachers in years 7 and 9, rethinking the ways that we talk about colonialism and its legacy in schools. And Sweet Rebellion responds to histories of British slave plantations and the Black activism that contributed to their abolition. So this is me telling everyone what it was, but I really want to hear you speak about this project.
Yeah, I guess maybe a good starting point is to say that both Jacob and I work with, or were working with colonialism and drawing at the time. And so there was sort of like a synchronicity in our work. And then, yeah, when we got invited to do the Cracks in the Curriculum series, I think for us it was really important to kind of, think about maybe a particular area of colonialism that was kind of somehow embedded in our work, but was not necessarily widely discussed in a British school context here. And so how can we kind of work around that and work with drawing and with play and kind of, bringing to light this history in schools when, it's just not getting enough attention.
Exactly, yeah, and maybe it's useful to say, for context sake, that me and Rudy have been working together for the best part of a decade now, almost a decade, and we both come from a DIY publishing, illustration, comic book kind of background. So the resource itself invites young people to make comics. There's a few different activities which it kind of instructs kids how to do, but one of them is to make comics, and as a way to engage with the future. So we introduced them to lots of different characters from the history of abolition, specifically Black characters, because often abolition is framed as something that comes out of the benevolence of whiteness, and then we decided slavery was bad and it stopped. But it erases all of the different ways in which Caribbean and African people were organizing, and not just organizing in more, the resource features, people like
Sam Sharp.
Yeah, Mary Prince. Nanny of the Maroons.
The Blue Jab Jabs.
Exactly. So it's also looking at people like carnival figures like the Blue Jab Jabs, which is a very expressive, angry, free, liberating, cover yourself in paint and scream way of thinking about how do we challenge hegemony and power. But we were asking young people to think about all of these different characters from the history of abolition, and how do we take their energies, how do we take their stories and imagine that they could be used to challenge the inequalities that you see in your day-to-day life, in the classroom, in your homes, in the world at large. So kind of an Afrofuturist, anti-colonial take on abolition and specifically sugar plantations. I think that probably sums it up.
Yeah.
So we pull up some images if possible. There's a PowerPoint that I know that you have prepared. And I know that Macarena and you work with pedagogy, with education. So I was just wondering if you had any immediate response to the work that Jacob and Rudy are doing from your perspective. There are also power packs that are available on the site. So if the ushers could please hand a few over to our audience so they can also look at them, that would be great. I just wonder how you engage you as practitioners and artists with pedagogy, and you, Macarena, as well, and with these topics and where they converge.
I mean, one question that comes up immediately for me is so beautiful, this sweet rebellion, the word sweet there. Because to me, it's like signifying this effort to get out of this masculinist history that is told through a particular kind of anti-violence, but also the kind of long histories of autonomy and communalism in the Americas, right, that have escaped the abolitionist imaginary that's long escaped the colonial paradigm. So what is sweet rebellion? I want to hear more about that. I mean, I know it's also the sugar, the plantation, it has many, many facets, but I was also interested in the pleasureful aspects of sweet rebellion.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think about kind of the ways that communities come together, like this sort of small resistances that are always ongoing, that like build up the possibility of rebellion. So, I mean, just in the context of Sweet Rebellion, I'm thinking about Sam Sharp and how, you know, he was a minister. And so that was actually like kind of embedded with his work in the church, allowed him to reach a large number of enslaved people. And through that, they were, you know, organizing community and, you know, had the Christmas Rebellion, which was, you know, predated the abolishment of slavery. So actually how it's something that's like constantly ongoing with people in the community.
Yeah, 100%. It'd be great if we could get the images of the art up on the screen. But yes, so, and of course, for people that don't know, the Blue Jab Jabs are one of many carnival characters that appear in traditional carnivals in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean, although have different names in different places. But it's a character that people embody where they paint themselves black or blue and put horns on. And it's directly a reimagining of quite an awful, violent history of people being punished by being covered in molasses, which is a byproduct of the sugar plantation, the sugar process. So there's a link to like the literal violent histories around sugar and the way in which that has been reimagined through creativity, which I think is always for me grounded in sweetness and sensuality. But then also I'm reminded of and thinking of the Jab Jabs as kind of these demonic characters in a kind of Winterian sense, but also they kind of look like demons. Recently, me and Rudy were speaking at an event. We attended an event by No More Exclusions. So No More Exclusions are an amazing organization in the UK that are pointing out that exclusions in the UK disproportionately affect black children, disproportionately affect children with neurodiversities, disproportionately affect children who are already at the intersections of inequalities. And they're a great group. You should find out about them and support them. But Rudy, you referred to yourself as a chaos demon. And I think as two people who kind of work in schools and work with young people as artists, we are afforded this creative license to kind of like have conversations that maybe more people who are more tied into the mainstream educational curriculum feel a bit stuck and unable to have those conversations. So I think there is a bit of, there's a more playfulness in what we're able to do. And yeah.
Yeah, I guess there was something that you were saying, but in a conversation that we had about like being able to be an access point for young people.
Exactly.
To start thinking about activism. And yeah, I guess kind of going back to the chaos demon, there's a bit of that being able to kind of come in as an interloper and being able to kind of like get undercover and be like, what do you think about this? You know, just coming in and like having those, you know, being invited as an artist into a space and then being like, let's talk about gender. We're 5-year-olds, or, you know, colonialism. What's colonialism? You know, and it's like, we're going to make some art. But then also, actually, we're going to have these really important critical conversations. And I kind of think about, in terms of like queerness as well, and like Sweet Rebellion, that we, you know, the way that queer and trans people, we need each other, that we always are in this sort of moment of needing to like assess and build and maybe resist in some way as well.
100%. And as we've got the resource behind us, I'd just say that, you know, I think one of the things that we're both trying to do is to elevate children to see themselves as instigators of change and educators in their own right. So maybe that might be a good time to...
You have a clicker over there.
Oh, cheers. Thank you.
So you can point, yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
So what we're holding is what we're seeing on screen. Can you tell us about this project that is a collaboration between Serpentine Education and Back to Earth?
Yeah, so this was made as our artist in residence with early years at Serpentine. And it was actually created during lockdown. So it wasn't initially intended to be this, but basically, the fact that it was in lockdown and we couldn't do the work that we were going to do, what we wanted to do was to try and platform, especially young people, Black people, Indigenous and people of color, young activists who are working with these really important issues. You know, one of them being years old at one point when she started Marika Penny, and show other young people, so it's aimed at 7 to 14-year-olds, show young people that it's possible for them to get involved in climate activism, and that it doesn't have to be this kind of all-encompassing thing, that it's something that they can start in their neighborhood or with their community, and that build on from there, and that there's actually already movements that they can find out about and feed into.
And also to kind of decenter the narrative, the colonial narrative that like people like Greta Thunberg, that it's always the West that are leading these conversations, and it's always kind of white people and white children who are at the center of these conversations, when in actuality it's always people of the global South who are the first to feel the extremist consequences of colonialism, and therefore there's a lot of indigenous and black and brown young people who are organizing around these issues. So it's kind of a light touch introduction to some of these concepts. It has quotes from people like the Aboriginal activist group, and quotes from other groups and young people. But it's just inviting young people to start imagining how these concepts apply to their own day-to-day lives.
I think it was important that there was like a level of playfulness. It's drawing-based activities, and so it's focused on the themes of water, waste, land, power, and change. And the idea is as well that these are perforated, so they can be shared. It could be something that you put up in your window, and kind of, I think inviting play was something that felt really important, that there is, like I said before, it doesn't have to be this really big thing. It can be like small, kind of like seeding something in them, basically.
Yeah. And what's exciting is that this is the first part of, we're continuing on this project now. So I don't know if you were about to ask about that, but
Yeah, and then of course I wanted to ask Macarena if she has an immediate response to the project for Back to Earth that Rudy and Jacob are doing, but maybe we start with that and then you tell us where it's going.
Well, I think it's just a beautiful project, and I'm also looking at the visual imprint and the kind of graphic style and noting the kind of histories of political art that are embedded in this. And so if you could speak more about the kind of aesthetic imprint that you're going for. And I also like that it has this kind of global, kind of history. It just maps onto so many struggles, right? And that feels really purposeful. So congratulations on that, please.
thank you.
I guess, these are sort of like, these are our drawing styles. So in terms of that aesthetic, that's just how we are.
Right.
But we were working with a designer, Shining Studio, who did all the typography. So we really have to say a big, massive thank you to Cameron for that. Because, I think that kind of felt a bit more collaborative, that we were like, this is how we want it to feel. And I think, maybe also because we come from DIY kind of like community organizing backgrounds, then, feeling this sort of like immediacy, I feel that it's been printed, that there's something textural to it, I think felt important. And Cameron really understood where we wanted to go with that.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this morning on the way here, like all of the different things that have come out of DIY publishing for me, and all of the different connections it's allowed me to make. And DIY culture, whether it's like punk music or like zine culture or community festivals and events, like it leads to so many different points of connection and power. So I think I like the fact that this does feel like at the end of it you've made a zine. It's like you've made a little publication yourself, because I think that hopefully that is in itself, as well as like engaging with all the different ways that you could think about water, change, waste, you're also seeing yourself as a maker. And also comics are just really important. I learned to read through reading comic books, and I think that for me they have a sweetness to them that feels more accessible than maybe something text heavy.
We should probably also mention the fact that it was made in lockdown meant that we were trying to think about the fact that there was lots of children who didn't have access to the internet, they didn't have access to drawing materials, so that's why each was supplied with a pencil, and the idea was that no matter what you had at your disposal, that you would still be able to participate.
Yeah.
And I think that we're now looking at your contribution to 140 Artist Ideas for Planet Earth, a book that we published together with Penguin as part of Back to Earth. Then I also want you to speak about the poster that you have in the Back to Earth exhibition, and do you want to walk us through them?
So the poster that we have in the Back to Earth exhibition, we were trying to think about the fact that when we think about climate justice, kind of like you said, it's so important to be thinking also about colonialism and all of the companies that profit both from colonialism and from the climate destruction that they're causing, mostly in the global south, and not just have like a singular thread, but make sure that there's a sort of multiplicity. So again, like thinking about how to platform indigenous knowledges and going back to kind of thinking about how do we return to practices that we actually already have. Like it's not just about creating something new, it's about already looking at the fact that we have all of this knowledge that maybe is being either ignored or just undervalued in some way. And that we don't always have to be in reaction. There's also, what are we trying to build? So rather than always being in a reactive state, being able to say, no, hang on for a second, actually, this wealth of knowledge is already here, and that's what should be put at the center.
Definitely, like setting the pace. I think that's really important what you said about not always being in a space of reacting, because I think that is unfortunately how so many people with activist practices tend to feel, like that there's no space to just breathe and see the large picture.
So this is the poster. What about, I know that we might have trouble, but what about the map that you were showing before that is in the book?
We just wanted to make something that I think we both we work with drawing, and like I said, we work with play, we both work with text, working with diagrams, and thinking about like what is the seed that someone needs to think about getting involved in activist organizing. Like what are the steps that maybe make it feel inaccessible. So being able to think about, well, who are you going to organize with? Well, you have people in your community, in your neighborhood. You already have local issues to organize around, and starting from there rather than always thinking we have to move towards national organizing. I think that there's a bit of a trend sometimes in the UK to think that we need to look at the national, when actually, our movements are much stronger when we start with these local movements and kind of have these smaller affinity groups and build like an infrastructure. So I think that's one of the things we were thinking about.
Definitely, and also something that I say all the time, and that we've spoken about lots before, is that anti-colonialism and anti-colonial thought is not an issue that is about Indigenous people and Black and brown people any more than it is about white, British, working class, middle class, whatever people. Like there is so many really tangible ways in which it affects everybody, around issues of water, around issues of waste, around issues of privatization that you mentioned, like the beaches. And I know it's been said, and hopefully it will keep being said, because I do think that a lot of people see anti-colonial movement as this thing that's ghettoized within Blackness and discussions of the global south, and doesn't relate to people who actually have a really vested interest in engaging with it, especially white working class people in this country and Roma Gypsy people who are white but are not racialized as white, who are seeing their access to green spaces, the quality of their air that they're breathing, the quality of so many really tangible issues that are clearly linked to larger scale colonial struggles. There's like a binary between these issues, which I think hopefully the work that we're doing starts to kind of undo.
That's great.
Do you want to tell us about what you're working on now and where we're going with the project?
Yeah.
We're working on the second Power Pack.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be working with some young people this summer to try and think about what is like the next step. So we kind of, because of the situation with lockdown and everything, we created this and then like put it out. But our desire with this is that we are going to be making it with young people. So we're going to introduce them to some of the topics, land, water, and air, and then kind of show them some groups that are already doing the work. And get them thinking about, okay, so how do you see yourself fitting into this? Are you interested in kind of doing something, building on what is already happening, or do you have another issue that you think is really important to try and platform? And through that, then we're going to create a learning resource, a Power Pack, for other young people, basically, with them.
Yeah, and maybe it's important to point out the illustration behind, or the one that just went, was Laurel, who was a former member of Land in Our Names, Lion, which is a black-led land reparations organisation based in the UK, who are getting lots of black and brown people across the UK access to land, and looking at the intersections between not having access to green spaces and knowledges around growing and mental health and a lot of other issues. And yeah, that's one of the aims of this project, is to introduce this group of young people who are going to be attending the week-long summer intensive to groups like Land in Our Name, like people running land projects, and different people who are doing that work on a grassroots scale, but also giving them access to art as a way to process those things.
Yeah, and I think also it feels important to say that it's people who are doing that work here. You know, kind of as Jack was saying earlier about being in a sort of Euro-American context, what work can people get involved in here? So as well, you know, the fact that some of the water companies have been dumping, you know, just a disgusting amount of raw sewage into the waterways that people swim in this country. And those are real kind of issues that people are starting to organize around, that they can get involved with.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned earlier about this binary between land and people. And I think the quality of air in London is so awful. You know, as someone who's had 2 collapsed lungs and has had surgery to permanently inflate one of my lungs, I think there's really tangible ways in which the quality of the air that we grow up around affects our lives. And I think a lot of young people, there's just really clear things to organize, like tangible, bodily, felt ways in which these issues affect our lives. So what I'm really excited about is the potential for radical discussions, because I think if young people are making it and we're supporting them, then they get to decide what they say. So I'm hoping that because we're reaching out to groups like Gendered Intelligence and Flame and young people who are already organizing around these things, that there will be some radical, they'll maybe be a bit more disruptive, disobedient, yes, all of those things.
I mean, I really love everything you're saying, and I think one of the things that strikes me as so critical is this kind of engagement and buy-in, or however you want to put it, at the kind of real local level, but also with art, as you're saying, and using those tools in such powerful ways. I remember teaching kind of artists and working with artists at Pratt Institute and designers. The minute the assignment turned to them mapping their local communities, them mapping waste, the rivers, the byways, whatever it was, their housing structures, whatever it was, and parts of the world at that point, because it was a very international group and we were doing that on Zoom. When we turned to those assignments, they made films, they did incredible, you know, animation, the kind of tools at the disposal, I think, especially of young people who are, you know, growing up with these really sophisticated set of tools. So that's just brilliant, brilliant work. It's more a comment than it is a question, but.
And I think another tool is community, and I think that's one thing that we're really, you know, and it's more than a tool, maybe I shouldn't call it that, but yeah, hopefully the groups of young people that we bring together for this project are going to form meaningful friendships. And
thank you both so much for being with us today, and we look forward to the continuation of this project, and we welcome you all to come to the Serpentine and visit the Back to Earth exhibition, see your work there, and please visit Serpentine Education for more updates on what Jacob and Rudy are working on. Thank you, Macarena, for joining the stage, and thank you both for being here.